You're very welcome to today's IIEA webinar. I'm Seamus Allen, a researcher here at the IIEA, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Yana Gorokhovskaia, Research Director at Freedom House, for today's event, Transnational Repression, Persecution Across Borders. Yana is going to speak to us for about 20 to 25 minutes or so, and then we'll go to a discussion and a Q&A. You can join the Q&A using the button on the bottom of your screen. Please give your name and the name of your organization. Just to note that the event today and the Q&A are both on the record. I'll now briefly introduce Yana and then hand over to her. So Yana, as I mentioned, is a research director at Freedom House, where she works across multiple portfolios, including strategy and design. She's written and published widely on the topic of transnational repression, and her works appeared in leading outlets and publications. Before joining Freedom House, she worked as an academic on protest and politics in post-Soviet states, and she has a PhD in politics from the University of British Columbia. Yana, thank you so much for being with us here today. We're delighted to have you. I'll now hand over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Seamus, for that introduction, and thank you for having me. Maybe just a few words about Freedom House for folks who are unfamiliar before I start the presentation. So Freedom House is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We're based in the United States. I'm coming to you from New York. We were founded in 1941 by Eleanor Roosevelt and Wendell Willkie. Wendell Willkie was her husband's main opponent for the presidential election, and they came together after that in order to found Freedom House with the mission of getting the U.S. involved against the fight against fascism in Europe. And so our name is not that clever. The Nazis had Brown House, we have Freedom House, and of course our portfolio has changed over the last 80 some years, and now we work in research. We produce the Freedom in the World Index, which has been produced since 1973, and maybe people will be familiar with that, alongside many other publications, and of course the research portfolio on transnational repression. We also have a policy and advocacy team that engages directly with policymakers, and we have international programs. So we work directly with civil society around the world. So that's a little bit about us. I'm going to share my slides. Okay. So in this short presentation, I'm going to introduce and define transnational repression and discuss how it manifests around the world, who it impacts, and how governments are responding. And then I'm happy to take questions and have a further discussion about any policy or incidents that people may be interested in. To maybe step back a little bit, because I know that for many people, transnational repression is an unfamiliar term, so just to define it. This is a global phenomenon, and it's actually quite old and unfortunately fairly common. And by what we mean by transnational repression is a set of physical and digital tactics used by governments to reach across borders to silence dissent among their exiles and diasporas. And for as long as there have been authoritarian regimes, they have tried to coerce, intimidate, and harm people who speak out against them, even across borders. And even though people may not have heard the term transnational repression, I think lots of people will be familiar with some of the most famous incidents. So, of course, the assassination of Leon Trotsky by Soviet agents in Mexico in 1940. There's the assassination of Orlando Letelier in Washington, D.C. in 1976 by agents of the Pinochet regime. And of course, much more recently, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in Turkey by Saudi agents, which took place in 2018. So those are all cases of transnational repression. Over the last 30 years, transnational repression has become more common, and that's really for two reasons. One is that since the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union, there have been many fewer closed borders. So people have been able to leave the territory of a repressive state and move abroad. At the same time, we've had the proliferation of digital communications, which has really knit the world together and connected people across borders. And so people have been able to leave, but their voices continue to matter even outside of the territory of their states, and they're able to communicate. And so we've seen kind of an explosion of transnational repression coincide with those two factors. Freedom House began working on this issue in 2019, but I can't take credit for kind of the body of work because this is really a topic from the academic community. And in fact, there's a sociologist named Dana Moss who really coined the term, and she was looking at activism within the Arab diaspora in the US during the Arab Spring. And she has a book out if you're interested. And many other people have been working on this issue as well, usually regionally focused. So Professor Moss had worked on the Arab diaspora. There are others, Ed Lemon and others who worked on transnational repression in Central Asia. Freedom House began to notice that critics were being targeted across borders, as I said, in 2019, and it took us up until 2021 to release our first report on this issue. That first report and much of our subsequent work is based on a data set that we maintain. This data set counts physical direct incidents of transnational repression that have happened globally over the last 10 years, so 2014. As of January of this year, 2025, the data set includes information on over 1,200 unique incidents of transnational repression perpetrated by 48 governments in over 100 countries. So this is truly a global phenomenon. And about a quarter of all the world's governments engage in some tactics of transnational repression. But there are 10, the 10 that you see on this slide, who are responsible for the vast majority of incidents of transnational repression, about 80%. China, which is responsible for the most incidents we've tracked, conducts the most sophisticated global and comprehensive campaign of transnational repression in the world. It uses the most tactics against the most targets, including individual targets, but also whole groups like the Tibetans, the Hong Kongers, and the Uyghurs. Turkey conducts the world's largest campaign of kidnapping and rendition. So it often grabs people abroad and then brings them home to face trial. Russia's transnational repression campaign once focused on former insiders. So I think maybe people will be familiar with the poisoning cases in the UK, including most recently Sergei Skripal. But since the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia has really turned its attention to war critics and other activists around the world. Cambodia recently joined this group of top 10 perpetrators with a big spike in activity in Asia. And a lot of that has been linked to the succession from Hun Sen to his son Hun Manet recently. The big kind of takeaway here is that a lot of transnational repression in terms of its tactics, in terms of kind of the ebb and flow, mirrors what's happening domestically in the repressive countries. So one example of this is Iran. Iran has a long history of targeting people abroad, and in fact, since the revolution, essentially. But we see the kinds of people who are targeted change over time. So most recently, since the protests inside of Iran, journalists have become, Persian language journalists have become really big targets of transnational repression. There were several incidents in the UK, and the EU actually today just issued sanctions against Iranian proxies committing transnational repression. This is a description of some of the methods of transnational repression. So although direct attacks like assassinations and assaults often get the most attention, methods of transnational repression include indirect forms that rely on co-opting host country governments or the mechanisms of international cooperation. So for example, we see a lot of abuse of Interpol notices. Interpol notices that should not be political in nature get issued to try and detain critics abroad and have them repatriated. Governments can also use consular services and the authority that they have over passports to prevent exiled critics from traveling or to compel them to return. As an example, in 2023, the Alexander Lukashenko regime in Belarus announced that they would no longer be doing passport renewals abroad. And this was very dangerous for the some 300,000 Belarusian citizens who had left the country during the protests and now faced either becoming stateless because they couldn't renew their passport or returning home to possibly face imprisonment. Lastly, threats from a distance are a big part of transnational repression. This is probably the part that governments have had the hardest time dealing with through policy. These include coercion by proxy, which is threats against family and friends who are still in the home country, and digital threats, including the use of spyware to surveil targets. Our data indicates that at least 19 governments have used spyware for some form of transnational repression, often to collect information on the target and then facilitate a physical attack. This is a tactic spiral. I know it's a little bit small, maybe hard to see. The point that I really want to make here is that perpetrator governments, which is the governments you see listed outside on the outside of the spiral, use more than one tactic of transnational repression. So it's not as if a target only faces physical assault or, say, digital threats. It's that they often face all of these. So they are targeted online, they're surveilled, their family is intimidated. They also may face a physical threat, and their ability to travel is often imperiled. So it's this whole set of tactics that's being used. The targets of transnational repression are, of course, human rights defenders and activists, but also people who don't consider themselves to be activists. So international students, for example, or journalists, or members of religious or ethnic minorities. So as I said, a lot of our research is based on this data set that we maintain, which provides kind of a snapshot of the breadth of transnational repression globally. But we have also done a lot of interviews with people who are targeted by transnational repression to try and understand the impact that these tactics have. And here is a snippet of some interviews we did for a report on how transnational repression affects journalists working in exile. And we were really glad to have kind of their perspective, firsthand perspective on how this has impacted both their lives and their work. Really, the main takeaway here is that the impacts of transnational repression are total. So they are physical, they're social, they're psychological, they're professional, they're financial. If you think about if you are being targeted by a foreign by a foreign government and you're thinking about traveling for work, you have to consider whether you have all your travel documents, whether your passport is valid, whether you can be extradited from any of the countries where you may stop over. For instance, many people stop over in Dubai while traveling, but that's extremely dangerous because Dubai has been known to extradite people or detain them as a result of other governments asking them to do that. So you have to think about all of these things. And of course, if you are, say, a journalist or an activist, that makes your life really complicated. The fact that people's phones are often breached means they have to spend a lot of their money on digital security, which is a really kind of a David Goliath battle because you don't have the same resources as a state and you can't possibly protect yourself from all forms of commercially available spyware. And those are only some of the kind of impacts. I would say that the biggest psychological impact is the impact it has on a community. Often people feel that they can't share the fact that they're being targeted with their community for fear that they will be rejected or ostracized, or that people will just be afraid to interact with them. And so it creates this lonely and silencing effect over time. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about what kind of government responses there are, what we're seeing in the world, both at the kind of domestic and at the international level. So when we typically look at government responses, we look at three areas of policy. So domestic security policy, migration policy, and foreign policy. And I would say, generally speaking, the most has been done on security policy and the least has been done on migration policy. Why these things matter. So domestic security policy responses matter because often these things are criminal. So you need high awareness among law enforcement, among the intelligence agencies in order for them to protect you, but also to impose some form of accountability, whether that's arrests or prosecutions. At the foreign policy level, you also want accountability. So what you want to see are sanctions, visa bans, persona non grata designations for embassies and diplomatic staff that engage in transnational repression. And a lot of those mechanisms, unlike the security policy, those already exist for many states. So governments already have access to sanctions and visa bans, and we see that those being used as well. In the migration space, what we really see is that people who don't have access to permanent forms of legal status in a host country are uniquely vulnerable to transnational repression. When people are afraid to go to the police because they're afraid that something will happen to their immigration status, or they just lack sort of citizenship or permanent residency in their host country, they may not feel like they have the right to the full spectrum of rights that others have in that country. More and more countries around the world, and I think we've seen this over the last 20 years, have done away with permanent forms of immigration statuses, or have made them much more difficult to obtain, or offshored immigration and asylum processes. And all of those things aggravate transnational repression. It's sort of a side effect there. It's not a direct result of transnational repression, but it makes people much more vulnerable. And not surprisingly, we've seen the least progress on the migration space. Some examples, specific examples of kind of good practices. So the FBI in the United States established a website for transnational repression. It has many different languages. It talks about what transnational repression is. It makes a big point of saying that whoever you are in the United States, you have access to fundamental rights. There's a reporting line. If you call the reporting line, the person on the other end has been trained in what transnational repression is. And this sounds really simple, but they have a pull-down menu where they can actually check the box for transnational repression. So the government is actually counting how many incidents are being reported. This is a whole new thing that's happened over the last 4 years. There's also what they call a fusion cell at the FBI that is dedicated to investigating transnational repression. I'm not aware of a similar arrangement in any other country, so the United States is unique in that sense. Some other examples of positive policy responses. There have been public inquiries into transnational repression. So the United Kingdom is actually just finishing a public inquiry that's going to come out with recommendations for the government. The Canadian government has finished an inquiry about a year ago and came out with policy recommendations. Both those inquiries included people and groups targeted by transnational repression and really took account of the phenomenon. I would say that the biggest downside or the biggest problem with policy responses thus far has been a securitization lens. So for many governments, transnational repression is wrapped into the bigger problem of foreign interference. And foreign interference can include a lot of things, right? It can include election interference, it can include spying, it can include disinformation, but transnational repression is often not treated as a separate issue. And that creates problems because it's, while it is a security threat, it's much more about impeding people's exercise of fundamental freedoms. And so a rights-based approach is one that's really needed, whereas most governments are still viewing this as a national security issue. I'll talk a little bit about some things that are happening kind of in the policy spaces that I'm hopeful about. So in the US, we've really urged lawmakers to adopt a definition of transnational repression and to codify it. As far as I know, this doesn't exist anywhere in the world yet. Why you need a codified definition of transnational repression is to get everyone on the same page. So without a codified definition, interagency cooperation, either on information sharing or on responses, it can be hindered by the fact that people may be talking about different things. So really setting out a definition is important. It's also important for public messaging. So we need to have a clear message to individuals in the public about what transnational repression is, what their rights are, how they can report it, what's being done about it. I recently testified at the Tom Lantis Human Rights Commission, and the co-chair is Representative McGovern, who has tried several times to initiate legislation that would codify transnational repression. Those, if folks on the call know anything about how Congress has been functioning, those have not made a lot of progress, but we remain hopeful, and it's something that I also advocate for other governments as well. On the European Parliament front, we've talked to a lot of MEPs who from different parties who've been interested in this. It's only this year that I've seen quite a bit of action. So right now, the Human Rights Subcommittee of the European Parliament is it has already had a study done of transnational repression and produced the special rapporteur, who is Chloe Riddell, has produced a report, and there should be a resolution in the fall. And a lot of that, from what I've seen, has focused on shoring up, I would say, the human rights protections, or the protections for human rights defenders who are in exile in Europe. So one of the problems is that right now the EU has, I would say, a pretty system of helping human rights defenders, but a lot of that is focused on getting them out of a bad situation in their own country and resettling them abroad. But of course, with transnational repression, the threat follows you abroad. And so what we need are mechanisms of support for that once those people have been resettled. And I think that European Parliament is working on that right now. I know that there will be another study commissioned by the Foreign Affairs Committee at the European Parliament as well, probably in the fall. The United Nations has done some work on this. So there have been 2 side events from the Human Rights Council on transnational repression. The second one was actually attended by the delegation from China, which voiced a lot of criticism of this agenda. But nevertheless, there's been some progress. I would say that the biggest thing that's happened is that the OHCHR has produced a pamphlet in their civic space division about transnational repression, and it details what it is, what are the tactics, how you can kind of protect yourself, and I think that's pretty meaningful as well. And then lastly, and very exciting for us, the recent G7 meeting in Canada actually ended with a leader statement on transnational repression. And not only was there a leader statement about that, laying out the definition and tactics, but they also, the G7 leaders, made a commitment to quite an ambitious plan of multilateral action on transnational repression, including monitoring through their rapid response mechanism, but also extending funding to groups that are dealing with transnational repression, and devoting some money to combating digital transnational repression. So I think that that's also promising. I would say out of the small group of countries, so that would be the US, Canada, the UK, Germany, lots of countries are still unaware. This isn't really high on their radar. And so the progress we've made, I think, is quite uneven, but it's certainly come a long way since 2021, where no one really knew what the term was. And in fact, our own communications department at Freedom House told us not to use the term because it would be hard to understand. So I think we've come a long way, but we're still really far off from comprehensive protections and comprehensive accountability mechanisms for transnational repression. So I'll finish there. Very happy to answer questions. I'll also say that the data set we maintain, we don't make it, it's not publicly available on our website, although we do have a website with lots of our reports and things like that. But if researchers are interested, we do share it on a one-to-one basis. So people can feel free to email us and ask for that data set.